Today on Threaded Together podcast, we touch on a topic that's as hot as it sounds: pressing and ironing. This isn't just about smoothing out wrinkles, it's an exploration of the crucial differences between pressing and ironing and why these techniques are essential for both home sewers and professional tailors.
We'll cover steamy details, how pressing can shape garments, and why a tailor's approach to ironing might change how you think about this everyday task.
Learn how professional ironing setups differ from what you might use at home and how these differences impact garment care and presentation.
We'll share tips and tricks and tools from the world of haute couture that you can use to get your garments pressed to perfection.
Join us for a practical yet intriguing discussion that will leave your clothes looking flawless and your ironing skills sharpened. Hello and welcome to Threaded Together, a podcast that stitches together home sewing and high fashion. We're your hosts. I'm Tracy.
I'm Rebecca. And in today's episode, we'll be discussing the steamy subject of pressing. This is our 19th episode, Season 2, Episode 7 for Threaded Together. We are so excited to have you.
And we're thrilled to have you back listening to us again.
And don't forget to find us on social media at Threaded Together Podcast, where you can see what we're working on and keep up with us between podcasts. Just give us a follow. Now, Tracy, is there anything current event fashion focused you'd like to kick us off with?
I recently went to the Victoria and Albert Museum to see the Naomi exhibition, and the exhibition covers Naomi Campbell's career in fashion. It's got over 100 of her outfits alongside cover shoots and videos and clips, and it also includes the moment she fell over in the Vivienne Westwood shoes, with it displayed alongside the original outfit with a specially designed mannequin to imitate the fall.
Oh, wow.
And it's also got the silver sequined Dolce & Gabbana dress that she wore as she finished her community service after pleading guilty to assault for throwing a phone at her maid. So it covers all the highs and the lows, and it's an incredible exhibition. But I really, really enjoyed it, and I recommend it to anyone who's able to go.
Sounds like such a key pop culture plus fashion timeline.
Yeah.
How fantastic.
Really is. It's excellent.
Sounds like I need to find a way to pop over to London and see that then.
Yeah, you do.
Well, I haven't done anything quite as exciting, but I did finish reading a fashion book I'd like to recommend.
Mm-hmm.
It's Isabel Toledo's memoir, Roots of Style. And Isabel Toledo was a Cuban-born American designer. But I have to confess, I bought the book originally because it is fully illustrated by her husband, Ruben Toledo, who is famous in his own right in the fashion world for being a fashion illustrator. Now, a little story time for you, if you don't mind. He used to do a lot of work for Nordstrom, which is a big retailer in Seattle where I grew up. I remember when I worked in the corporate offices for Nordstrom, several senior people had original drawings of his on their walls in their offices like it was just nothing. And I thought they were just the most beautiful things, and very often had to resist the urge to just be like, do you really need to keep that? I'll just, take that home with me since I loved it. Anyway, I bought the book originally for the illustrations, but the story is absolutely fantastic. She tells it through the lens of her career as a designer, charting a very unconventional yet successful path through the fashion industry at a unique time that both overlapped with Yves Saint Laurent and Lagerfeld in the 1970s through to the rise of Westwood, Galliano, and McQueen and the chaos of the 1990s fashion scene. It's a great, easy read with, of course, incredible illustrations. So 10 out of 10 would recommend.
That sounds like a really, really great read. And I've had a quick search since you mentioned that, and it really does look like an incredible, beautiful book. So I'm going to have to track a copy down.
Absolutely.
So we're really excited to talk about our main topic, pressing, today. But before we get into that, what have you been working on in the last month, Rebecca?
Well, Tracy, we set some lofty summer sewing goals in last month's episode, which is fantastic. However, I've just begun one of the projects. I picked apart a vintage jumpsuit I wore recently on holiday in order to make a pattern out of it. It falls into last month's category of the kind of uniform dressing we were talking about, as I'd like to recreate it in as many colors and fabrics as I can. It fits so well. How about you, Tracy? What have you been up to?
Well, I think all my big plans for summer sewing that that we discussed in the last episode have been quashed somewhat by the weather in the great British summer. Also, I haven't had as much sewing time as I would have liked. So yeah, lots of big sewing plans, not enough time, which always seems to be the case. But I did make a jacket, which is the Absolute from Atelier Scammit, and it's in this reversible quilted cotton, which is in these gorgeous, like fabulous colours of coral and pink and turquoise and orange. And it's really fun and vibrant to wear. I've also started on a dress, so we'll see if that makes my holiday or not.
I can't wait to see the dress, but I have seen that coat and wow, that fabric is incredible. So it's just a quilted cotton. Was there like a heavy repeat on it? It doesn't look like it. It almost looks like you took just a vintage quilt and just, tossed it into a jacket.
No,
It's
it's
gorgeous.
literally as the fabric came. It's this incredible,
Wow.
incredible quilted fabric. It's gorgeous.
I'm going to need to look that up. We're going to need a link, Tracy. Today, we're discussing pressing and all of the tips and hacks we use to get the perfect finished garment. And it may seem like it isn't the sexiest of topics, but the knowledge of how to properly press a garment during construction can make the difference from looking like you did some home sewing versus creating a couture level garment. Sadly, this is also an area of garment making that's often missing, I feel, from newer sewing books. For example, when we were doing some research for this, my 1980s Vogue sewing book has an entire chapter on pressing. However, another text that I own, Sewing for Fashion Designers, which is published in 2015, gives the topic a whopping 3 pages, 2 of which are just showing photos of tools used in the process. So Tracy, first thing is first, what is the difference between pressing and iron?
Well, I like to think of it as one that I do my very best to avoid at all costs, and one I take very seriously. But seriously, ironing is where you slide the iron back and forth, just back and forth and back and forth, and pressing is putting the iron to the fabric, holding it there and removing it. So it's like an up and down motion instead. And with pressing, it really is about raising and lowering rather than gliding along the fabric, so you aren't distorting it.
That's a great summary. And I confess I had to look this up in my Vogue sewing book because I wasn't quite sure the difference. And it said pretty much exactly the same thing. Pressing is the process of lifting the iron and setting it down in the proper position. But then they added this note I thought was interesting. They said you can use pressing to accomplish feats not possible with needle and thread. And then they also listed lots of rules to follow, which we do or do not love.
I think that's so good though, because sometimes when I've got a bit of wobbly sewing, I always look at it and go, it's fine. It's nothing that a good press won't fix. And most of the time, actually, a very good press will fix a little a little sewing mishap.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And most of my knowledge about pressing comes from the Tailor jacket making course that you and I met on, Tracy, 2 years ago this month. So I think it's timely that we revisit the subject this month, even though in the midst of summer, I think we might sometimes want to think once or twice before heating up the iron.
Yeah, and whilst using those irons in that 40-degree heat 2 years ago was a lot. Pressing is so important for the finished garment, and you really, really don't want to scrimp on it.
Absolutely not. And just for background for anybody listening who hasn't listened to our 1-year anniversary episode, which is also a great listen, we happen to be learning how to make our jackets and press in a famous London heat wave where there were actually buildings spontaneously catching on fire, and we were in small rooms with commercial pressing machines. So that's what we mean when it's still important to get that pressing done.
So pressing's so important throughout the sewing process, from prepping your fabric initially to setting the seams to melding the threads. Shall we start with talking about prepping your fabric for sewing?
Yes. So this is when we iron instead of press. When preparing your fabric for use, we often say, give it a good steamy press for shrinkage. But after that, and before you start cutting out your garment, you do want to actually be ironing it. Using Dave Page Coffin's legendary tome on shirt making, he says, quote, "What you want to accomplish in ironing yardage is to stretch it gently and evenly lengthwise and avoid distorting it widthwise. Thus, you need to iron with the straight lengthwise grain of fabric that is parallel to the selvage, rather than side to side across the grain." He goes on to explain that the reason for ironing the fabric, actually distorting it a bit with the iron, is so that you are then sewing on fabric that's stretched the way it will be stretched when it's ironed as a completed garment. If you don't do this first iron of the fabric that stretches it slightly, then the body and the sleeves of the final garment will be more elastic than the seamed areas, which would make it more difficult to avoid wrinkles on the seam lines when ironing the garment.
That's such an interesting point, and it's certainly going to make me stop and think about how I prep my fabric initially.
Same.
Yeah, I think I just merrily iron it. But we've talked in the past about blocking fabric, especially when prepping it for cutting or for pattern cutting. And blocking
Mm.
fabric is basically where you are using the steam of your iron and the fabric itself to manipulate the yarns of the fabric so that your crosswise grain and your lengthwise grain are at complete right angles to each other. So you've got perfectly aligned fabric. And that's something where your iron and a good steamy iron can be really useful as well.
Yeah, and I do think that the seaming vertically parallel to the selvage is pretty intuitive. I think we kind of do that already.
Mhm.
Because when you think about when you're laying it out and even just trying to get all the wrinkles out before you start
It's the
cutting,
most natural
that's
way to lay out the
it
fabric to
is.
prep it. Yeah.
Yeah, so while it is something we, should be thinking about, I think it's something that we naturally just
Yeah.
do when we're trying to prep for cutting out.
Yeah.
So,
That's definitely true.
but now we know why.
We do. So, a really interesting need for pressing and what gives you beautiful seams is the concept of melding threads. So, in the book, Couture, The Art of Fine Sewing by Roberta Carr, she describes how after you've stitched a seam, you want to press it in exactly the same way that you've sewn it. So press the seam flat. And doing this melds together the top thread and the bobbing thread into the fabric. So what you want to do basically is to have to press the stitching line flat, first on one side and then on the other, and then press the seam open. So she goes on to suggest that the importance of this process, to understand how important it is, try running your finger over a row of stitches that is literally fresh off the machine, and then compare it to one where you've done that process of pressing it either side and then pressing it open. And you'll see how the difference is. The first one will have this ridge as you run your finger along the thread, and the melded thread is hardly noticeable at all from the fabric itself. So it's like blended into the fabric, really sunk into it. So sometimes you might have heard of this referred to as setting the stitches.
I don't think I've actually tried to just feel the difference between the two, but now I'm definitely going to try that.
Yeah, I think probably more noticeable on some fabrics than others. Some I think it sinks in naturally a bit better anyway, but some fabrics definitely, I think you can definitely feel it. And I think it's worth reiterating a point here, and it is something that we learned on the jacket course that you mentioned earlier, Rebecca, and that's really about pressing what you've sewn and pressing it open and then pressing it in the direction that you want. So doing multiple presses of the same seam rather than where it calls for the seam to be pressed open, not just going straight in and going for that. To press what you've sewn first. I think as a home sewer, it's quite easy to skip or overlook or try and shortcut this step. But trust us, it really, really does make the absolute difference and really can create some beautiful seams.
Absolutely. And I'm, again, glad you added that setting the stitches note, because I do triple press, having learned it from that class, but I had kind of forgotten why.
And it's the kind of thing that when you're following the instructions to some patterns, they're quite specific about the fact that you have to do this thing. And you're like, but why? Why? It definitely is worth doing.
I haven't necessarily heard the term of setting the stitches before. If I'm remembering correctly, on that course, she had positioned it as something like relaxing the fabric on either side to allow the stitches to essentially do the same thing, blend better with it. So just a different way of approaching the same result.
There are lots of tools that you can use to help your pressing set up. And depending on the garment and the fabric you're working with, and the seams you're working with, Tools can really make a difference. So, for example, when working with delicate fabrics, you'll benefit from a pressing cloth. But when you're working with a woolen coat and you want nice, crisp seams, you'll benefit from the use of a clapper. We're going to take you through each of these tools one at a time.
We're going to start with some tools that should be in every home sewer's toolkit. They're fairly intuitive, and then move on to more specialty items.
Yes, that's a good idea. So a pressing cloth is a piece of fabric that you use between your fabric and your iron, and it can help you apply pressure with your iron without leaving an indent on your fabric, or as means of providing moisture, or as a means of assisting with the drying of your fabric. So it's really multi-purpose. And if you're working with a fabric that has a risk of a sheen when it's pressed, then it can also help prevent that. In Love Sewing magazine, in an article for Love Sewing magazine, Wendy Ward says that you should always use a pressing cloth on coating weight walls, so you can go like really high with the heat on them, with silks and delicate fine fabrics, and that's so that you're not marking or denting the fabric. And then with synthetic fabrics, because I guess if you're not quite sure how they're going to take the heat or press, I definitely like melted some cheap trousers in my past. And so, yeah, synthetic fabrics.
And the worst is getting it off the iron when you melt it to the iron, speaking from experience.
And then obviously if you're working with something like PVC or pleather or oilcloth or any kind of like speciality fabrics, then that will help you get a nicer finish as well if you're using a pressing cloth.
Sometimes the best fabric to use for pressing is just a scrap of the fabric that you are working with, since it'll behave the same way but protect your finished garment. Also, a sheer pressing cloth can be really useful as it allows you to see what you're working on. You could use silk organza for this or a plain cotton. But I will add a side note, having used both of these, my standard pressing cloth in my sewing room is a plain white cotton. And I have used silk organza, but be careful, sometimes it will transfer.
Well, you want a nice clear one, ideally.
Yeah, use a clear silk organza, not a red one.
Okay, so onto the ham. The Tailors ham is a tightly stuffed, curved shaped pillow, and it typically has one half of it made of wool and the other half made of cotton. You can use the woolen side to quickly absorb the moisture from the iron, and because it's this like firmly packed pillow, it corresponds to your body curves, so you can use it to help press curved seams, so like curved shoulder seams or hip seams or princess seams or darts that are curved. And you can also use it, I don't know, to shape the cap of a sleeve, like the roll of a collar. It's got endless possibilities because of the shape of it. It's also useful for basting as well, if you want to retain the curved shape while you're working on your piece. And I recall on the course we did, Rebecca, we used a ham for some of the hand stitching we were doing to kind of create a curve while stowing. Do you recall that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember that she had a ham that she said we could use because it was the pad stitching around the dart that was in the chest piece of the jacket. So you're trying to create a curve. So it makes sense that you would do it on the ham, but I remember it very vividly because our teacher on the course was explaining that if you had a nice voluptuous thigh, you could use that instead of your ham and then put the curve on your leg, and the body heat from your body would actually help warm up the wool and help it curve even better. So Tailor's ham or your leg.
With an iron though.
Not with an iron. No, for pad stitching. Yeah.
So these hams, they range from about £10 up to buy. Like they're quite cheap. But you can also make your own one, and there are lots and lots of online tutorials for this, and it allows you to use up some nice scrap fabrics and make one in a size that works for you.
And Tracy, do you use your Tailor's ham often? Do you find?
Yes, I definitely use it a lot. Yeah, definitely on curved pieces like the, I don't know, collars and things. And I think it depends what you're sewing. There was a jacket I made earlier in the year where basically every tool in my pressing kit was used at some point for various things. So whether it was for pressing the darts or the sleeve head or various bits, but I definitely do use my ham a lot. Yes, I think it's a good investment.
I was actually thinking along the same lines as you were, that I think I use it most for shaping collars and lapels and all of these things that you kind of forget are curved.
Okay, so onto the sleeve board. And this is something that I've only recently, I guess, in the last couple of years, added to my pressing station. But it's so useful. And on the rare occasion that I do offer to iron my husband's shirt, mainly because he isn't allowed to touch my iron. Um,
I love that.
it does allow for these perfectly pressed sleeves. So a sleeve board is like a little mini ironing board, but it will fit a sleeve on it, and it's really, really useful for smaller areas like necks and shoulders and cuffs.
My sleeve board is actually my most used thing on my ironing board. I didn't think it was going to be when I bought it, but it's rare that I am sewing something with a seam that's longer than that. And even if it is, you can have more control over it with that raised surface. So unless it's really a wide leg trouser, I do almost everything on that little mini board. But I'll tell you more about how I use it when we get to the couture techniques.
I look forward to that, but I do agree. You definitely have a lot more control, and the fact that it's raised slightly really makes a difference. And there's certain things where it's just always on top of my ironing board, and always something I'm using.
So, why do you need so many tools, you might ask? Well, each of these different tools actually makes your garment making easier, despite the impression that they might do the opposite since you have to learn what to use them for. A good way to understand this is to think about which tool we use for which seam type. For example, curved and rounded seams are pressed in the same way as flat seams, but as we mentioned earlier, you use different tools to maintain your shape. Like we said, a tailor's ham or cushion could be used for any curved seams to maintain their curve while pressing. And again, darts should also be pressed on a subtly rounded pressing surface.
Definitely. So there's also some very cool tools that I guess are a bit more specific for various tasks. The first one we want to talk about in that category is the clapper. A clapper is a piece of wood, and it's got this little groove in the middle, so it allows you to grasp it and work with either end. One's like narrower and one's wider than the other. And after you've pressed a seam, if you hold the clapper firmly onto it for a few seconds, it will absorb the moisture from this freshly pressed fabric, and it allows a nice flat and crisp hem or seam. So it really, really works wonders on woolen coats and things. And it really does leave this beautiful, crisp seam that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get with certain fabrics by pressing them alone. So some fabrics are a bit more bouncy, I guess, and therefore really helps with that. To your point earlier, though, in some of these fabrics you might also want to be using a pressing cloth as well, but that's something you've got to experiment with based on the fabric you're working with. There's also the velvet needleboard, and we talked about this a bit in episode 11, which was sewing occasion wear. It's also known as a velvet board. It's got a few different names, and it's basically a canvas board covered in these very fine short wire bristles, and it's really useful on napped fabrics like velvet. And you basically place your fabric face down onto the needles so that the pile of the velvet is protected and isn't crushed when you're working on the back of the fabric. And again, because it's on this canvas board, you can put it over your tailor's ham or your sleeve roll if you're working on a curve, and it's a really nice size as well to sit on your sleeve board for that ultimate precision. So it's a really versatile bit of kit, but they are quite expensive, and so I recommend just keeping an eye on eBay.
Tracy, I actually saw a hack for that in one of my books that mentioned using an old hairbrush.
Oh.
Now, I do wonder about the quality of the hairbrush, because I know if it was a plastic something or other, probably not the best thing to
Proper
be.
bristle hairbrush. That sounds like a great
Yeah.
idea.
When you're pressing open a seam allowance, sometimes the edge of the seam can actually create a crease on the right side of the garment. To alleviate this, you can place a piece of brown paper between the seam allowance and the main fabric, or you can use a handy tubular cushion that sits under the seam allowance and prevents that from happening, called a seam roll. It's a long padded cylinder, and like the ham, typically has cotton on one half and wool on the other. It's a nice size. You even could fit it into your sleeve too if you were pressing the outside, as long as you have your pressing cloth in between.
So point presser is another one that's worth mentioning, made of hardwood, and it's used for pressing. It's got this like point at the top, handle type thing, and it sits on top of a wooden clapper. And so you can use it for pressing out the lapels and collar points, creating these nice, perfect finished corners, or you can use the bottom of it as a clapper to, as we discussed earlier, to take the heat out very quickly out of your fabric. And so if you were torn between getting a clapper or a point presser, I personally would say get the point presser because it's dual purpose.
And while I was looking at this enviously, Tracy, thinking that would be a clever tool to have, you actually have one. So,
Yep, I do. Because when I first started sewing, one of the early things I made was this coat, and I wanted to, use a clapper, and I was trying to work out what I could use, and ended up using a wooden dropping board, which is great. But obviously, the steam brought out some of the aromas from the original dropping board, and so I figured at that point it was best to invest in a specific tool.
that makes sense. Well, then similarly, a point increaser is a small wooden tool primarily used in tailoring to push out points and turn corners. This can also be used during the pressing process to hold the seam shape while pressing. It almost looks like a little guitar pick end on a short stick where the other end is curved, I guess. So this can be used during the pressing process to hold the seam shape while pressing. Basically, in lieu of your point presser, you have a little pencil-sized one that just fits nicely inside your seams. And I think we had to get one of these for our aforementioned tailoring class, Tracy. And I actually use this tool all the time. Do you use yours often? I guess you have the big one, so.
I don't think I've got one. I've got some like plastic ones, like some little, well, not plastic, heat resistant ones. I think it's also worth pointing out some really cool hemming guides out there. So the hot hemmer, we've got all the best names. The hot hemmer is a ruler on a heat resistant material so that it can withstand like the iron and the heat, and allows you to measure and fold and hem in one step, so you can kind of see what you're pressing to, what distance you're pressing up to. And so some of them are made from like, I don't know, temperature resistant plastic, or they might be on a canvas or a silicone. And so they're really useful tools when you're hemming. You can get the measurements in one. It's very nice. But when you're choosing one of these, you want to find out whether they're in metric or imperial, and pick one that's your preferred unit of measurement, because I've got one that's in inches and I never use that. So
The area of pressing is one of the few places where you see a massive difference in the tools used for home sewing versus professional fashion. And the reason, quite simply, is the ideal pressing machine is quite large, not to mention expensive, and a massive fire risk.
the most commonly seen professional ironing setup is an industrial ironing table, which is a vacuum system set into the ironing board itself so that the steam applied to the garment is instantly sucked out, cooling the fabric in the process, resulting in a sharper pressing effect.
These commercial tables also have attached to them all the accessories you could need, such as a sleeve board, and often have direct connections to a water line so you can use an immense amount of steam in a very short time. And Tracy, you had found an interesting commercial setup on Instagram, didn't you?
Yes, there was this incredible video of a professional setup where they're pressing a jacket, and it's basically using the shapes like you would get from a dress form, and the contrasting piece is like a concavity of the other, and the jacket is pressed in between the two. So there's like an actual shape for the shoulder and something that would sit on top of a shoulder to press the shoulder shape in. And it's like, what we would be replicating at home with a ham and a lot of steam and pressing cloths and so on. They have these machines that just have the correct shape and do it immediately. And yeah, we'll definitely share a link because it's like this incredible video.
Yeah, it's hard to describe, but quite compelling. You're like, if only I had one of those, everything would be perfect.
I don't think I have quite the space for that.
No, me either. We also have some couture tips to talk about, but just because they're couture techniques doesn't mean that they are necessarily complicated.
No, that's right. So I've got a few I'd like to share, again from the Roberta Carr book that I mentioned earlier. So one of the items she says is to make sure that you press in the same direction as you stitch. And that one sounds really easy to overlook, but I think it makes a massive difference in terms of pressing. She says as well about how you should always let your work cool before moving it from the pressing surface. And that's something that makes
Mm.
absolute sense, because if you think about the fact that
Mhm.
when your fabric is heated or a bit damp, it's easier to distort. So if you pick it up while it's still hot, you might distort it in the process of moving it. So you should let it cool. And that's where, the ham and the clapper and things come in useful as well, to remove the heat from your garment. And another tip that you mentioned a little earlier as well is about avoiding leaving impressions on your seams. So certain fabrics are more prone to having a little impression, so seeing the ridge of your seam as you press it. And so to avoid that, you can use strips of brown paper or heavyish card. So slipping it under the seam allowance and pressing, and then that will help remove the chance of an impression being left on your seam.
Especially on some of those delicate
Mhm,
fabrics where it's really gonna make a
mhm,
difference. I wanted to take a step back for a sec to the pressing in the same direction as you stitch,
mhm,
because I remember on our jacket course, and this is something I actually think about quite often, we had been told you should always be sewing away from the center of the body and then down because it influences the way the fabric will stretch.
mhm.
So then ironing in that same direction goes back to kind of how the fabric is stretching on the seam.
But yeah, it's something that you do want to try and make a more natural habit so that you don't stop and think about.
One of my favorite couture tips isn't, I think, actually a couture tip at all if you look in the right sewing books, but you don't see it as often in conventional instructions. So after you've done your first two presses of our three press process, when you are pressing open a seam on a lightweight fabric, including a fine wool, such as for suiting, often the seam is quite closed after you've pressed it twice. So you need to actually relax it before pressing it open to avoid the risk of pressing it in a position that isn't fully opened. And I think we've probably all done that before on accident.
Mhm.
The tip for this is to use your sleeve board because the fabric hanging off the sides of it tends to kind of raise up that center seam before you even do anything with it. And then have the seam in the center of the board, then using just the very tip of the iron, slowly nudge open the seam while hovering the iron above the seam. So no pressing yet. And just slowly move the iron the length of the seam, giving it a teeny bit of steam as you go. This should relax the seam open and then allow you to press it perfectly open on the next pass.
Nice. That's a lovely little tip. So let's talk about our pressing station. Mine's like my ironing board is typically covered with the project I'm currently working on, all the pieces of it, and the next bit of fabric that I want to work on as well. It's like
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
an extra workstation.
Yes, absolutely. Never enough space.
So I have a Philips Azure steam iron and I love it. I think that long time listeners will know that I've raved about it in the past. I don't think steam irons are built to last forever. I mean, they do quite a lot of work. So this iron comes with a very good warranty. Philips have been very good at replacing this iron when I've broken it. But what I really like about it is how I can move from one fabric to another without needing to think about the settings. Like literally, you can move from silk to wool to cotton to denim, and the steam does all the work. There's no changing settings, which works nicely for me.
That sounds so lovely.
Yeah. And I live in a really hard water area, and limescale can be quite a problem. So to mitigate against that, I try and use filtered water, and the iron has this like descale function as well, so that you can kind of get rid of some of the limescale every now and then. And I think the thing is that when you live in an area with hard water, you can also try mixing tap water with distilled water or using special iron water to mitigate against the limescale problem.
Well, I'm delighted, Tracy, because I actually have a tip for that.
Oh.
So, living in Germany, where the minerality and hardness of the water, I swear, is unparalleled, my hair can tell you. A small amount of white vinegar, though, mixed with water, is a natural way to descale things and perfectly safe for You, your pets, everything.
Mhm.
So you just let it sit for a bit and then steam it out, or steam some workout clothes that need a good refresher that you would have tossed that in the washer for it. But I mean, I use that to descale my coffee machines. It's the best. It's
Ah.
like magic. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
might give that a go. I also wanted to mention my ironing board cover. So Prim have this ironing board cover that has 1 centimeter squares on it, and like angles and measurements and things and so on. And so it isn't perfectly accurate because of the way it distorts from the amount of use it's had over the years. But it can be really helpful when pressing hems and you want like a long straight line or something, in addition to all the other tools we've mentioned. But it's quite a really nice ironing board cover that I recommend.
And you'll put a link to that in
Yeah, absolutely.
show notes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely need to check that out too. Well, my iron is nothing special. We already know this, Tracy. You have the Ferrari of irons, but I have not yet upgraded. I also think my ironing board cover is from a drugstore or something, but then my ironing board is pretty wobbly and probably also from a drugstore. So don't be copying my setup. But if you would like an incredibly in depth DIY non steam iron suggestion, I would highly recommend referring to David Page Coffin's book we mentioned earlier on shirt making. He outlines his custom approach to not only ironing, but also setting up an ironing board slash table contraption with a little pulley system. It's a fascinating read for the pressing
Yeah.
enthusiast, and one that suggests perhaps less is more when it comes to the balance of technical advancement versus technique. Several pages of fascinating reading.
Excellent.
Pressing garments isn't always about finishing the garments. There's a lot of crossover into the world of fabric manipulation as well, both for functional and purely aesthetic reasons. Tracy, when you and I were doing our couture tailoring course, one of the biggest aha moments I ever had was when our tailored jacket pattern had ironing instructions to actually deform part of the jacket to make room for the body. It was a brilliant way to use heat and moisture and its effects on cloth to create something truly on another level of garment construction. Another way that pressing can make a garment take on a completely different form is through pleating. For home sewing, pleats can be pressed carefully to create a sharp fold or steamed for a softer rolling pleat that relies on the seam to create most of the shaping. In a more commercial setting, this takes on an entirely different characteristic, however. And Tracy, you have become a bit of an expert on that, but it sounds like that might be a good topic for another episode.
That would make a fantastic episode. But before that episode, what are you making next, Rebecca?
Well, I was recently watching Sweet Home Alabama, which is a rom-com from 2002 for the first time in a very long time. And first off, I was surprised how well it held up considering how cringy and out of touch I find most movies like that from that era to be. Anyway, I have a point. There is this dress that Reese Witherspoon's character wears with lots of shearing and these barely attached sleeves. And I was absolutely in love with it when I was in high school, but could never find anything like it. Oddly enough, it's a style that actually became more mainstream and popular more recently, I think in like late 2010s, early 2020s. But while my 16-year-old self could never quite find the right dress, my 30-something-year-old self can now eyeball a pattern for it. So I'm going to make something for my younger self next, trying my hand at some ruching and shearing and make a little dress.
Oh, that sounds absolutely super.
And what about you, Tracy? Anything you're planning on making next?
I think I've got lots of carry forward plans. So I'm not committing to anything at the moment. I'm sure I'm going to change my mind the moment I come back from holiday.
Well, you have the holiday you'll be working on next.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, while you're on holiday, Tracy, I might reach out for some tips since I have never done shearing before, but fabric manipulation is something I'm very excited to learn more about.
And serendipitously, I just picked up a book on the subject. So I'm sure we will have lots to discuss. In our next episode, we will be talking about the art of fabric manipulation.
So grab your elastic thread. We're going to be discussing shearing, pleating,
Origami style folding, ruching, and of course, our favorite books on the subject. Oh, and smocking. So I guess I'm going to have to make that smocked top now, aren't I?
I guess you will. So gather yourself up and your fabric and get ready to fold into this fabulous subject.
But before our next episode, if you have any thoughts, ideas, or questions for us, you can always find us on social media at Threaded Together Podcast. In the meantime, I'm Tracy.
And I'm Rebecca. And this has been
The Threaded Together Podcast.
See you next time.
Looking forward to our next episode in a month. Make sure you give us the thumbs up on Apple Podcast or follow us on Spotify. You can find more details on what we discussed today in the show notes below or on threadedtogetherpodcast.com. And for more behind the scenes and regular updates, you can find us on all social media channels at Threaded Together Podcast.